Do a countdown. Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project. And on this podcast, we talk about art, culture, politics, sport, and anything else in between. And today's guest, I'm delighted to have on. I've just finished a brilliant book, which is The Power to Say No. Her name is Dr. Vanessa Patrick, and she's here to talk to me about it. So, Vanessa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm so excited to be here.
That's good. That's very good. As I say, read the book, absolutely love it. And it was relative to my life, especially in my younger years as well. But before we do the deep dive into the book and also the subject of saying no, for those who may not know you, can you just explain who you are, what your journey basically through life and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. I'm a professor of marketing at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. I'm also the Associate Dean for Research, so I manage the research enterprise. So research very much is my passion, and I love doing it, and I love reading about research as well. And so the book that I wrote is based on my own research, and it's my first book, so I'm very excited that I've written many research articles that are targeted at academic journals, but this is my first popular press book, so I'm quite excited about it. And it's on a topic that I care a lot about and is related to my research in the sense that I'm a consumer psychologist and I'm really interested in how people make decisions and how they separate the good for me decisions from the bad for me decisions. And so whether it is in the domain of, managing the calories that you take in, or managing the steps that you walk, or the tasks that you take on. At the end of the day, we do need to figure out what are the things we should do and what are the things that we shouldn't do. And this forms the heart of my research.
Okay, good stuff. And you first start off the book by a personal story of yourselves where you're working in an office in the 90s, and then an incident happened and it kind of led you on this path to this book.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just briefly explain that and how you led you on to this book?
Yes. So I motivate the book with a personal story. And this anecdote took place when I was one of the most most members of the organization. I was fresh out of college. It was my first job. And as the junior most person, I was expected to do all the tasks that nobody else wanted to do. So, one of the tasks that I was assigned was to take notes of every meeting that we had with the client. So, this was an advertising agency, and we had client meetings all the time. And every time we had a meeting with the client, I was the one who had to take the notes, and we called them the minutes. And I had to take the notes, show them to my boss before faxing them off to the client. And then the client would read those minutes to make sure that I had gotten all the points that were discussed and send them fax back saying that they had received it. So this was a pretty routine task. I did it every other day, every time we had a meeting. So that particular day sticks out in my memory because it was my birthday. I was turning 24 that day. And of course, I went to the office. It was a Tuesday. And I went to the office and I did this. We had a client meeting. I knew that I needed to finish this task off before I left for home. So I typed up the minutes, showed them to my boss, faxed the minutes. Done. Or at least I thought I was done. Because I wanted to go home because my family was hosting a party to celebrate my birthday and friends and family were coming for dinner. And I was all ready to leave at around 5 p.m. when my boss comes to my desk and asks, "Did you fax the minutes?" And I said, "Yes, of course." And she said, "Did you receive the fax from the client saying that they have received the minutes?" And I said, "No." And so she turned around and she walked to the elevator and she turned around and she said, "Do not leave till you receive the fax saying that they have received the minutes." And that could be forever, as far as I was concerned at that moment. I was thinking, wow, I mean, I have a party I need to attend. I seriously, genuinely thought that when she turned around, she was going to say, hey, Vanessa, have a great party, enjoy your evening. But instead, she tasked me with something like waiting for a fax. And so I spent the whole evening waiting for that fax. Everyone started leaving and going home. At around 9 p.m., about 5 hours later, I received the fax. And all it said was received with thanks. And it made me think about how often we spend our time doing things that are completely useless just because someone told us to.
Yeah.
And why we do those things and why we don't have the courage or the internal power, the empowerment to stand up and say, and push back against those kind of asks. So that incident is something that a lot of people relate to, because if you think about it, all of us who have ever worked in any organization can think about a time where they have done stuff that they really shouldn't have wasted their time doing. And I think because it's such a relatable issue, and so often we get trapped in these situations where we don't feel powerful enough to say no.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. And actually, I was going to ask you my first question, my main question we cut of the book is, why is it important to say no as opposed to yes all the time?
Yeah. So it's it's important to say no to the things that don't matter. So it's not about just saying no. It's about choosing wisely, choosing the things that are good for you to say yes to, and choosing and not choosing the things that are not the best for you, not aligned with what you want to achieve, not aligned with your goals or your purpose. So the book is about focusing on developing a lens with which to decide what to say yes to and what to say no to, and learn to say no more effectively to the things that come our way. It's very easy for us to say yes. You don't need a book to teach you to say yes, because that is the human tendency, is to say yes when someone asks you for something. What you need a book for is to help you, give you a lens, give you the language, give you the motivation to say no to the things that are not aligned with your purpose, not aligned with who you are, and not aligned to the things that matter.
Yeah. So, in regards to saying no, uh,
Mm-hmm.
because I know a lot of people who might act tough and say they'll say no, just may say no all the time, or they act that way, but when it comes down to it, to certain situations, they'll just crumble and say yes anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just
Yeah.
wondering what environmental situations affect whether we're more likely to say no or not.
So a lot of people say yes when they want to say no. And there are three main factors that drive them to say yes when they want to say no. One is a concern for relationships. We often say yes when we are worried that people will stop liking us, stop being our friends, stop inviting us places. And just so that we want to be included in the social group, we often say yes to things to feel like we are part of the group and the community. The other reason we say yes when we want to say no is because we are concerned about our reputation. We want people to think well of us. We want people to see us as competent, capable, able to handle whatever is thrown our way. And so we say yes because we want to secure our reputation as a good and capable person. The other reason, which is really ingrained in society, is that we often say yes when we want to say no, simply because no one has ever taught us to say no. We are socialized to be cooperative, to be helpful, to be giving, much less than we are taught to be self focused, ambitious, focused on our own goals, agentic, if you will. So we are not taught those things. We are much more likely to be taught to be supportive, kind, giving, cooperative.
I've known people in my life who are very outspoken, and
Mm-hmm.
that way from a very young age. And you talk about socialization there, which I agree with, but is there sometimes a genetic component to it? I.e., if your parents were necessarily people who are outspoken said no, that makes you more likely to have that personality trait.
So I don't get into that in my book because I'm not a personality psychologist, but obviously there are going to be differences in how you are brought up, the extent to which you are taught to voice your own thoughts and opinions. I do find a gender difference, like a lot of research finds a gender difference in the ability to say no. So women are significantly more likely to say yes to a workplace request. They are more likely to be asked to do tasks that no one else wants to do, the office housework, if you will. And they are more likely to say yes to those tasks. So things like organizing retirement parties and picnics and picking up the coffee and donuts, it very often falls on the shoulders of women just because they are more likely to say yes to doing these tasks.
Mhm.
And so we do see a gender difference. And I'm sure that there are situational factors. There's not enough research about it to be able to conclusively state like what are the genetic factors.
Yeah, absolutely. I, as a teenager, I don't drink alcohol, and I haven't been
Mm-hmm.
like that since a teenager. But it was interesting that the friends or so-called friends I had at that time, they used to drink quite a lot, and they was always say, "Oh, come on, Chris, have a drink," and I would say no. I was very resolute. I'd always
Mm-hmm.
say no, and that was something that I believed in. I don't do it today. And the reason I asked that, say that story is how important are principles in regards to whether you say no or not, especially if you're someone who's like religious and there's certain things you won't do because of
Mm-hmm.
your religion.
Yes. Yes. So, in fact, the way I propose you say no is based on your identity, who you are. So it comes across as much more powerful when your no comes from who you are and what you believe, gives voice to your values. So in your case, it's, you don't believe that you should drink alcohol for whatever reason. That's just your principle. I don't drink. And when you say I don't drink, it comes across as much more empowered than saying I can't drink, for example. Because as soon as you say I can't drink, then people are going to push back against that. In the same way, people who are, need to eat gluten-free food or lactose intolerant, it is a biological makeup that prevents them from eating. And in those cases, they just say, I don't drink milk or I don't eat wheat or bread. In those cases, no one pushes back with them because it's who they are, right? And so, what we need to do is we need to learn from these particular cases and think about looking inwards to identify what is it that's driving my desire to say no. And how can I give voice to those values, priorities, preferences, and beliefs in the way I say no?
There's one, and in fact, you just said there about I don't, and there's one
Mm-hmm.
thing in the book you mentioned about I don't, as opposed to I think I can't. Why is
Yes.
that? Why is that contraction of I don't more important than saying I can't? Is it the definitive nature of it? Whereas with
Yes.
I can't, it's more maybe if I've done this, then maybe I'll be willing to do.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Precisely. You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the way it is. I mean, the logic of that work is that the words we use matter.
yeah.
And how we frame our refusal makes a big difference in how effective that refusal is. So when we say I can't, we come across as disempowered, not in control, suggesting to the asker that under some different circumstances, I would. Right now, I can't. And that invites negotiation. It invites the asker to have a dialogue with you about why you can't. As soon as you say I can't, people say why not. Whereas when you say I don't, you implicate the identity. You say, this is who I am. It is based on a value, it's based on a principle, it's based on a belief. This is my position on the matter. So it's much more definitive. It is also much more stable. And because of that, it comes across as uh, more determined and with greater conviction. And because of that, we are better able to communicate our no and not get pushback from others.
There's something in the book which I would like to explain to the audience, which is you use the acronym of REACH. Can you just explain what each letter means and just go into detail about each one?
So in the book, I talk about the art of empowered refusal, which are the 3 competencies that we need to develop to be able to craft a more effective refusal response. The art of empowered refusal, ART, is an acronym for awareness, rules, not decisions, and totality of self. And these are the 3 competencies we need to invest in to become better at communicating an empowered refusal response. So the first one, awareness, involves spending time thinking about yourself, developing self-awareness, understanding what your values are, what your priorities are. How do you prefer things to be? What are the beliefs that you have about a particular issue? And how do you want the world to be? What is the world according to you? And that you-centeredness forms the essence of the refusal, stemming your refusal from who you are. And once you've developed this deepened self-awareness, you become much more capable of setting up a set of rules, simple rules that shape your actions and decisions. Those rules are what I call personal policies. So personal policies are just simple rules that we set up for ourselves that give voice to those values, priorities, decisions. And those personal policies form the foundation or the infrastructure that gives us the power to say no more effectively.
Yeah.
When you say that I have a policy about something, I believe something, this is where I stand on something, people are much more likely to accept that and give you less pushback. And so knowing where you stand makes your refusal much more persuasive. And the final thing is the totality of self, which is that it's not enough to just use your words in the way you say no, but you need to use your body language effectively as well. Very often people say no, but their whole body language is shrinking or communicating that they are not convinced about their own no. And people pick up on those body language cues. You're more likely to get pushback, and people are much more likely to counter you if they see that your body is not acting in concert with your words.
Yeah.
Another way in which non-verbal cues are very important in refusals is that even though you are saying no, your body language can communicate that your no is not a refusal of the other person. It is not a rejection of the other person. It is giving voice to your values.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and you can use effective body language cues that signal that you value the relationship with the other person. You might be saying no, but you still value that relationship. And so smiling, making eye contact, leaning forward, these are all the natural nonverbal cues that you can rely on to become much more effective in the way you communicate your refusal.
Now, obviously, we're talking via Zoom at the moment, but in regards to saying no, is it a lot easier if you're not seeing a person? So, say, for example, if you doing it via email or even a phone call,
Yes.
how does that affect the effectiveness, as you know, and also the likelihood that you're going to say no as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's research that shows that we are 34 times more likely to say yes to a face-to-face request.
Oh.
And so essentially, if you want to say no, very often it becomes much more easier if you can convert that face-to-face conversation to a digitally mediated one. So we are able to craft a refusal better and be more effective at communicating a no if it's via text or email, as opposed to face-to-face.
Okay. It's obviously it might be easier, but does that mean you lose respect as a result? Because in a way it
Not
seems,
necessarily.
oh, okay, all right. All
I mean,
right.
it's really an issue of how you communicate that. So it's you, in fact, I think you probably have because it's digitally mediated, it's not immediate. So you can actually take the time to craft a refusal that is more um, where you can solidify the relationship, and you can use your language to be able to communicate that you are saying no, but this is not a refusal of the other person, much more easily via text or email than it is in person. Because what I find is that people really feel very much in conflict when you're asked something that you want to say no to. And I call it the spotlight effect. It's like as soon as someone asks you for something and you want to say no, you feel this immense conflict. You
Yeah.
feel like there's this spotlight on you and you are trapped. And so that face to face conversation makes the spotlight much more intense. We are much more likely to succumb and say yes in the heat of the moment.
Oh, cool. I have to say, my favorite part of the book was when you talk about the walnut trees,
Ah.
because I've come across quite a few of them in my life. Can you just explain what you mean by that? And also, how do you combat the walnut tree?
Yeah. It's my editor's favorite chapter of the book as well. So, walnut trees are the metaphor that I use to describe pushy askers, people who will not take no for an answer. Because the reality is, we can learn the skills, we can develop the competencies, and we can communicate our empowered refusal. But there are going to be some people in our lives who we will encounter, undoubtedly, who will just ignore all of that, and they will still insist on their way. And the reason I use the metaphor of the walnut tree is because the Black American walnut tree is a species of walnut tree that grows really big and tall and has a luxuriant canopy. And it has a root system that goes out 50 feet in the soil. And it exudes into the soil a toxin called juglone that diminishes or stunts the growth of all the other trees in the vicinity. So only the walnut tree thrives. Every other tree is just stunted. And so very often it helps people to think about, toxic people or difficult people or jerks that we encounter as walnut trees, because, they are exhibiting a particular kind of behavior that you don't like. But once you see them in a more playful way and say, oh, that's just walnut tree behavior, I have strategies to recognize walnut tree behavior, call it for what it is, and then deal with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So, walnut trees very often will push back against your refusal. They might do anything from like scream and shout and yell and throw a tantrum because you said no to them. Some people do that. Other people will get completely cold and give you the silent treatment or ghost you, for example, because they don't like you, the fact that you said no to them. And so there are a whole range of ways in which walnut trees might respond to your no. But it's your job to kind of deal with that walnut tree. And so I offer some strategies that would help you deal with the walnut tree. Some are pretty straightforward, which essentially means reinforcing via a whole range of, you can send an email, you can write a phone, or make a phone call, essentially communicating what your personal policy is, explaining where you stand. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you need to take it just to repeating your no. I mean, you ask me 5 times, I've said no 5 times, you can ask me 100 times. It's not going to change my answer. And as soon as you start doing that, in fact, one of the women in my research said that her boss used to be a yeller.
Okay.
And every time he yelled, she just went softer. She just created a vocal contrast. And he would suddenly realize that he was screaming and yelling at her, and she was whispering. And it was just an effective strategy for her to just like not take it personally and refuse to give in. So it was, everybody has to develop once you understand how your walnut tree operates, your particular species of walnut tree, you have to develop a set of systems. So I give in the book a whole range of options that you have. Sometimes if you're lucky, you can delegate your no to somebody else, have someone else say no to you. They're not listening to you, then maybe your colleague or your boss gets to say no to them. So there are different strategies that I come up with, but most importantly, recognizing how walnut trees behave and knowing that there are ways to manage walnut tree behavior is really the important part.
Okay, so let's have a scenario. Let's say a salesman knocks on my door and I don't really want to see them. I'm not interested in the product, but I don't really want to slam the door in the face, but I want to be firm. Now, obviously, with salesman people, especially if they're experienced, they know how to deal with those situations when someone says no. So, how in that situation would someone be firm and say no? Obviously, you don't want to shut the door in the face, but be firm and say no to the point where salesperson says, "Okay, then sorry, sir, I'll speak. Take
Yeah.
care." Yeah.
So if you think about the art framework, it's really about understanding why you want to say no to the salesperson. So for example, I have a personal policy where I just do not make an impulse decision to buy stuff just because someone's come to my door. I just don't. So that's how I will communicate it. I do not make decisions to buy something without having planned that purchase. And when someone says that to you, you can't force that person to change how they think about that decision. So you could have a personal policy like that, or you could say, well, I have a budget for, say, magazines, and this does not fit into my magazine budget, assuming that the person is selling magazines. So you have to come up with a way to communicate without getting flustered, without worrying about being rude, but reflecting, why is it that I'm saying no? Like, there has to be a reason you're saying no. It's motivated because you want to save money, because you're really not interested in the product. And you can communicate that as politely as possible.
Okay. So, and in interesting, moving on from the example I gave of a salesperson, if in terms of negotiation, because at the moment we've talked about no as being very definitive, but in negotiation, obviously you want something from that person and they want an advantage, want it to be to their advantage as well. So obviously there's certain things you're going to say no to, but how do you say no in a way that doesn't necessarily stop the negotiations between and the dynamic between two people?
Yeah, so it's, there are lots of negotiation tactics. And it's the end of the day, it's about what you want and where you stand, right? You have to know what your BATNA is, your best alternative to negotiated agreement is. And making sure that you are communicating through your refusal what your position is in the negotiation. A negotiation works best, in my view, when both parties leave the negotiation happy, right? So that's the goal. I want to make sure that in a negotiation that I am happy at the end of this conversation and you are happy at the end of this conversation. And in many, very often when I'm thinking about negotiation, it's almost like you're inviting the other party to put their feet in the same pool of shared meaning. If you can both figure out what is that pool of shared meaning that we are operating from, then your negotiation becomes that much more successful because you are operating from the same thing. I found that in most situations, if you can abstract out what is it that you really care about. In our cases as faculty members, we often care about student success, faculty advancement. And most negotiations are about resources that have to deal with these objectives. And so, regardless of where the negotiation is, if you can kind of abstract out what is it that we care about? What is the value that we are trying to uphold here in this negotiation? And getting both people in, as I talk about in the pool of shared meaning, which ultimately means we have a shared set of values, then the negotiation becomes much more fruitful.
Okay. Just going back to a point you made about reasons why people don't say no, and you talked about relationships. I think there's a section in the book where you talk about the certain relationships where you're more likely to say
Yeah.
no than others. So can you explain that in a bit more detail for our audience?
Yes. So we have all sorts of relationships with different people. Some relationships are really close, where we are really secure in those relationships. In those sort of relationships, like relationships maybe with our close family members, our immediate family, it's easier to say no to them because you're not worried about the relationship suffering. You're not worried that you're going to hurt the other person or that they're not going to talk to you anymore. They understand where you're coming from when you say no. The other group of people who we are very comfortable saying no to are complete strangers who we will never see again. So if someone approaches you in the grocery store who you're never going to see again and asks you for something, chances are you can say no without, feeling remorse or guilt. It is the vast majority of people who form a group of people who I call acquaintances. The people we work with at our colleagues at work, or maybe our neighbors, or maybe the people in the community that we belong to, who we have a passing relationship with. Those are the people who are the hardest to say no to, because we do not have that secure relationship with them, and we are concerned about what they think of us. So both the relationship component and the reputation component come into play here, and therefore makes it that much more difficult to say no to this vast group of people who are called acquaintances. And I refer to that in the book as the acquaintance trap.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. Just give you another story from my life about saying no. A few years ago, about 10 years ago, I was doing a degree part-time, working full-time, writing and performing poetry quite a lot. And I was asked by a friend who was forming this charitable trust if I wanted to come onto the board of his trust. And I said yes. And a friend of mine warned me against it because he's saying, Chris, you're doing a lot of stuff anyway. Why do you? He says, oh, I'll be fine. And I plodded along, I was getting tired. And then basically, long story short, I went away for a few days and I was tired every day because I've been so tired doing stuff because I didn't say no because I didn't want to disappoint my friend.
Yeah.
So when I came back, I said to my friend, I can't do this anymore. And she was initially disappointed, but at least she respected my honesty. And I felt a lot better for it, not just mentally, but also physically. And I'm wondering, in a weird sort of way, does saying no actually help us physically? Because once we say no, that pressure is, oh, I've said it now. Now the pressure's almost off.
Yes, absolutely. So whenever we are thinking about saying yes to something, we need to evaluate the trade-offs. When we say yes to one thing, we are saying no to other things. And those other things include things like rest, well-being, mental relaxation, our ability to sleep a little bit longer.
Mhm.
So in the book, I talk about thinking about asks that come our way and not looking at whether you can do it. Like you talked about the fact that you said, I'll make it work. I can do it, right? But that can came at a cost of your own exhaustion and well-being and stuff like that. So what we should be asking ourselves when things come our way is, must I do it? So when we shift from asking ourselves, can I do it? Which kind of makes us think about reasons why we should do it and say yes. We should ask us, must I do it? Is this the best thing that I should be taking on that at this time?
Yeah.
When you ask yourself, must I do it? We come up with reasons for why this may not be such a good idea. And so sometimes just shifting that question, can I do it, to must I do it, will change the things that you say yes to. And it's so important to remember that, everything, I call it the house of cards trap, if you remember in the book, everything that we put in our calendar is kind of like a house of cards, which is becoming increasingly fragile. Every card that you put on, everything you add to your calendar is making it more likely that that entire house of cards is going to collapse one day. And I often ask the people in my classes, is it better to say no upfront, saying, I'm sorry, I'm so tied up at the moment, would love to help, but this is just not a good time for me, and get the no out right away, or say yes and drop the ball later, which is going to be more damaging for your reputation. I think it's better to say no right up front than to say yes and then not be able to deliver.
Yeah. Just expanding on one point you mentioned there, I think it was Thomas Sowell who said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of there's no long-term solutions, only trade-offs. I think that's what he said anyway. And in terms of saying no, when you decide to say no, is that something you have to weigh up? The fact that if you say no to this, there's always going to be a trade-off. It's not going to be perfect for everything.
100%. In fact, in my chapter on self-awareness, I talk a great deal about making that trade, understanding the trade-offs, and recognizing the opportunity cost. Because every time we say yes to one thing, we have to give up on a potential opportunity. And so when we think about that, we become much more careful about what we commit to, because there might be something better that comes along that now we have no space for because we've got a completely committed calendar or a completely committed roster of activities.
Okay. With all this, because we've talked about different groups being able to say no and whatnot, and so on and so forth, does this come with practice? I take it, the fact of just saying no, and then you just basically almost training a muscle in your mind where eventually you'll get so used to saying no that people actually, before, especially if they know you well enough, they'll come up to you and say, oh, if he says no, this person's going to mean no, and actually respect you more as a result.
Absolutely, 100%. So it is practice, definitely. I very often say, if you wanted to climb a mountain, you wouldn't just take mountaineering gear and walk up the mountain. It doesn't work that way. If you want to play the cello, you can't just pick up an instrument. Everything that's worth doing takes work. And so you need to practice, and you can practice with baby steps. You just have to start saying, these are the pain points. And in the book, I outline a framework called the dream framework that helps you identify what are the pain points I'm experiencing? What are some of the things I would like to change? What are the habits I'd like to break? What are some of the things that are happening that I wish wouldn't happen? What are some pain points? And how do I develop a personal policy? How do I invest in the self-awareness I need? And how do I enact that? How do I say no to those things so that I can emerge feeling more fulfilled, have more time to do what's meaningful, spend more time on things that make you happy and fulfilled and content?
Can you just expand on the idea of pain points for those who are unsure what that means?
Yes, of course. So pain points are essentially the things that cause us anxiety, stress, anger, frustration, resentment. Sometimes we say yes to things and then we're really mad at ourselves for saying yes and really mad at the other person for asking us. And so we need to understand where those pain points are and make sure that when we find ourselves in those situations that we don't repeat those mistakes again and again. So recognizing a pain point is acknowledging that this doesn't work for you. This is not good for you in the moment. And then making a decision about changing it.
Yeah. Just as a flip side to what we've said so far, are there certain situations where actually saying no could be a bad thing?
So I definitely talk about the fact that there are times you should say yes and times you should say no. So I have a framework in the book, which you might remember, called the Decipher the Ask framework, which is really about the different types of decisions. But there are different times. So for example, when you're very junior in an organization and you've just entered the organization, you've just entered the workplace, you're exploring the different avenues that life has to offer. When you're in that exploration phase, it's a good thing to have more experiences, to explore new things. So if someone says, hey, why don't you try doing this, whatever it is, you might say, well, I don't know how to do it, but that might be a fun thing to learn. And so when you're in a learning and exploration phase, sometimes it's good to say yes, but at some point your exploration ends and then you have to focus. And you have to say, these are the things I'm going to be really good at. These are the things I want to be known for. But
Is there,
there's obviously a time and place to explore.
yeah, I was going to say about safety as well. If you're doing activity, say, I don't know, mountain climbing, and the instructor says you need to do this, I imagine it's going to be a good time to say, actually, no, 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 let me do my own thing, because that'll
No,
just.
that would be silly, right? I mean, and I remember reading this interview with someone who is a famous astronaut, and he was talking about, the importance of saying no and the importance of saying no at the right time. So he says that he empowers the people on the spacecraft to kind of voice their own values, to express themselves, to push back against him when the time is appropriate. If there is a crisis situation and everyone needs all hands on deck, at that point, he is in charge of everyone's safety. That is not the time to say no and negotiate. And he makes a very important point, I think, because there are times where we need to just show up and do what is needed, right? And then there are times where we can reflect on it and say, well, that's not a good use of my time. Maybe I should be pushing back. But it's not, as you said, if it's a safety issue, you can't say, no, I don't believe in helmets. That would be foolish.
Yeah. Indeed, indeed. And just quickly, it's funny because we're coming towards the end. I can't remember the lady's name, but there's a lady you mentioned in the book who became a senator, and she basically was offered one job and she said no to that because she wanted to find something that was more relevant to the people she was representing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think before she died, she got the presidential
Uh-huh.
freedom. And it just made me think, would you agree with me that there's actually been a lot of changes in politics or moments in politics which have occurred because people have actually said no? Like the example you say in the book, also someone like Rosa Parks, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Sometimes, so her name is Shirley Chisholm.
Yeah.
And she's a fantastic woman. And a lot of people have been trailblazers and broken the mold of how things are because they had the courage to say no to the status quo, right? And so there are many, many stories, but those are the stories that are that we need to be inspired by. So I actually talk about Rosa Parks in the book as well. I talk about Shirley Chisholm. There are lots of people who I talk about in the book who have done amazing things to stand up for what they believe, stand up for who they are, stand up for their entire community and represent the beliefs of the entire community and make changes that are meaningful and long lasting as a result. And so, absolutely, the power of no can be really strong. I mean, if you think about people like Shirley Chisholm and Rosa Parks, it took a ton of courage to do what they did, right? And it did stem from their deep beliefs and their strong sense of who they are and how they want to see the world.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. And that's a very good note to stand on because obviously those two were trailblazers, and just by saying no, they carved the path for many people. As I say, I finished reading this morning. It's an excellent book. I would highly recommend it. Um, what I'm going to do in the description is I'm going to leave a link in the description as to where you can buy this book. Again, I would highly recommend it. If you're someone who's struggling to say no, then this book will help absolutely, and obviously put into practice. Vanessa, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Absolutely wonderful. Thankfully, like I said before, you didn't say no to this interview. So really cool. Thank you. So thank you for that. Again, thank you for being on 286 Project.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for your insightful questions and for bringing up aspects of the book that I think all readers would like to hear about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.